I'd like also to discuss a passage that many people use to teach inherited sin or to attack somebody who doesn't believe in inherited sin. And it's in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. But to get the context, I'll start reading at verse 5, and then we'll discuss this passage. It says, "And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. And as I may so say, Levi also, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham. For he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron?" And so, right there in verses 9 and 10, Levi, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So they'll use this passage to teach that we're born sinners because we were all in the loins of Adam when Adam sinned. And they create a doctrine of original sin known as a Federal Headship Theory. And that is that Adam was our federal head, and that when he sinned in the garden, he acted as all mankind would have acted if they would have been in the garden as well. And so I want to read A.T. Overstreet's answer to this objection. And it's from his a writing he did called "Are Men Born Sinners? The Myth of Original Sin." And it's it's a very what I feel like is a very thorough and to the point response to this passage that many people use as an objection to those who don't believe in inherited sin. So the objection would be that the Bible says that Levi paid tithes while yet in the loins of his father Abraham. This shows that we sinned in Adam, for we were yet in his loins when he sinned. And so this is his response. I'll just read it word for word. "But in what sense did Levi pay tithes while yet in the loins of his father Abraham? It was not in an absolute sense, which would have been impossible, because Levi had no personal existence at that time, but only in a typical sense. The point that the writer to the Hebrews wanted to make was that the Levitical priesthood was inferior to and superseded by the priesthood of Christ, who had an unending priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. And to prove that the Levitical priesthood was inferior to that of Christ, he points out that Levi had descended from Abraham, who, as great as he was, had still paid tithes to Melchizedek, so that Levi also, as a descendant of Abraham, yet in the loins of Abraham when he paid tithes, was also inferior and subservient to Melchizedek and his priesthood. And in this typical sense only, as a descendant of one who had shown he was inferior and subservient to Melchizedek by paying tithes to him, had Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek." The writer to the Hebrews shows that he is speaking of Levi paying tithes in Abraham in a typical sense by the language he uses. He says, quote, "And as I may so say, Levi also, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham," unquote. The phrase "as I may so say" is a limiting or qualifying phrase, which means I could say or I might say. The writer to the Hebrews never gave to his statement about Levi any other than a typical sense. Otherwise, he would not have limited his statement with the words, "and as I may so say." To teach from this passage that either the good or the evil that our ancestors have done is actually done by us is to wrest this passage from its context and to torture it into teaching utter nonsense. For instance, such an idea would make all the descendants of a Christian automatic Christians if his children were yet in his loins when he believed. Also, it would seem to make all the descendants of one who rejects the gospel automatic unbelievers, for coming out of the loins of an unbelieving father. In fact, if this theory is true, every good act of a man or every evil act of a man is counted as done by all of his offspring. But the problem with all of this is that we know that many godly men have had descendants who were enemies of God and vice versa. Abraham is an example of this. The Bible says that Abraham believed God and that his faith was counted unto him for righteousness. And Abraham is called the father of the faithful because of his faith. But Abraham has had millions upon millions of descendants who have not believed and have been lost. Yet according to the theory under question, all of Abraham's descendants should have been justified by his faith, for they were all yet in his loins when he believed God and was justified. Esau was a descendant of Abraham, but God said, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Romans 9:13. God destroyed the children of Israel, who were descendants of Abraham, in the wilderness for their unbelief, even though they were yet in the loins of Abraham when he believed. The problems with this nonsensical theory multiply when you realize that every one of us have been in the loins of numerous ancestors going all the way back to Adam. This means that we actually participated in all the good and evil, not only of Adam, but also of all our intervening ancestors as well. What an awful lot of good and evil we have done. We have all been busy for thousands of years in the loins of our ancestors doing good and evil. Now, do we get to pick and choose among our ancestors, choosing the ancestors whose deeds we like most, or must we heap them all together and take what they all have done? I am afraid that to do the latter would make our character quite a confused and conflicting thing. What if some of our ancestors were Christians and others were unrepentant sinners? Would we balance the good ones out against the bad ones and come up with what was left over? But the whole idea of sinning in Adam is a theological fiction that has been perpetuated to a large extent by Jerome's erroneous translation in the Latin Vulgate of Romans 5:12. He translated the Greek phrase, I'll try to pronounce it, F-O pantes himarton, by the Latin phrase in quo omnes peccuverent, which means in whom all have sinned. This translation was an error, and Greek students agree that it was. Nevertheless, this error has helped to form and perpetuate the false doctrine that men actually sinned in Adam when he sinned. The teaching that men sinned in Adam directly contradicts the Bible's plain teaching that men sin in themselves and not in someone else, and there is no other way that men can sin. Paul spoke in Romans 5:14 of them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. Paul referred here to those who had sinned before the giving of the law, and so had not sinned against a positive precept as Adam had, but only against the law of conscience and reason. Paul said they were sinners, but the fact that he said they had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression shows that Paul did not consider the sin of Adam to be their sin. Then in Romans 9:11, Paul, speaking of Jacob and Esau in the womb of their mother Rebekah, says, For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil. Now here were two very remarkable children who for thousands of years had been in the loins of ancestors all the way from Adam through Abraham and Isaac. And during all those thousands of years of being in the loins of different ancestors, they had never done anything good or evil. This astonishing fact is hard to reconcile with the idea that every human being was supposed to have actually sinned in Adam, and that Levi actually paid tithes in Abraham. And so I felt that that was a very thorough and good response to people who would turn to Hebrews chapter 7 verses 9 and 10 to teach inherited sin, or to teach the Federal Headship Theory, as if we all sinned in Adam because we were in his loins when he sinned. So I encourage you all to look at this PDF. Just Google "Are Men Born Sinners? The Myth of Original Sin" by A.T. Overstreet, and you can get free PDFs online. I encourage you to read it. It's 127 pages, but it's a very thorough investigation on the doctrine of inherited sin or original sin. So I just wanted to do a quick video on that passage because I know many people use that passage to support this doctrine, and it's not actually referring to a spiritual consequences of sin being transferred from parent or from father to child. It teaches nothing of the sort. So anyway, I'll end this here, keep this short, and yeah, just keep an eye out for my next video.